Hello movie lovers. Today, I'll be telling you the story of the movie Thunderstruck. It is a 2012 sports comedy movie starring Kevin Durant. Enjoy the recap. The movie begins with Brian, a high school student, watching a basketball game on TV. His eyes were locked onto his idol, Kevin Durant, who always dominates the court with his skills. Every shot, every dunk, and every move Kevin makes is near perfection, leaving Brian in absolute awe of the player. Inspired by the superstar's performance, Brian convinces himself that he, too, can master the art of dunking. With this enthusiasm, Brian rushes to his backyard to practice. However, he quickly gets a reality check as each attempt ends in failure as the ball continuously slips from his hands. His younger sister secretly recorded his failed attempts and then openly mocks his repeated failures. Meanwhile, Kevin Durant, fresh from another great performance, stays back after the game to sign autographs and interact with his fans. His manager, Alan, was there to ensure everything runs smoothly before they finally leave the arena. Back at school, Brian confides in his best friend, Mitch, about his interest in Isabel, the new transfer student. Brian sees this as his golden opportunity to make a fresh impression. Mitch, however, isn't convinced. He reminds Brian of his reputation, warning him that approaching Isabel might not go as planned. But Brian remains determined. Since Isabel is new, she doesn't know about his past, giving him a clean slate. Gathering his courage, Brian approaches Isabel during lunch, ready to introduce himself. Just as he prepares to speak, disaster strikes. Connor, the school's notorious troublemaker, suddenly interrupts. He plays a video on the cafeteria's large screen, and to Brian's horror, it's the humiliating footage of his failed dunk attempt. Instead of making the dunk, the clip captures Brian being entangled in the hoop, his feet embarrassingly stuck in the basket. The entire cafeteria erupts into uncontrollable laughter. Humiliated and unable to bear the ridicule, Brian abandons his plan and walks away in silence. That night, as Brian lies in bed, defeated and questioning his self-worth, his father enters the room. Seeing his son in distress, he offers the perfect getaway, an opportunity to watch Kevin Durant play live. Overjoyed, Brian eagerly accepts, seeing the game as a much-needed distraction from his embarrassment. At the arena, the excitement intensifies when the halftime announcer introduces a special event. A random fan will be given the chance to take a shot on the court for a $20,000 prize. As the winning ticket number was announced, everyone checked their numbers and fortunate enough, it was Brian's father's ticket. Without hesitation, he quickly hands it to Brian, proudly declaring his son as the winner. Although he was nervous, Brian steps onto the court as he faces thousands of expectant eyes. He was given the ball and told the rules. When he is asked to shoot, Brian focuses on the basket, takes a deep breath, and makes the shot. But instead of sinking the ball, he completely misses the hoop and accidentally strikes the team's mascot and knocks it over. The crowd bursts into laughter, and once again, Brian finds himself at the center of public humiliation. Overcome with disappointment, he is slowly escorted off the court. Just when he thinks the humiliation would end his fun night, Kevin Durant appears before him. Sensing his frustration, Kevin decides to sign a basketball and hands it to Brian. He tells him that failure is just a stepping stone and that hard work always beats talent. Brian, still overwhelmed by the moment, jokingly wishes he had Kevin's talent. Smiling, Kevin hands him the ball, and as Brian grabs it, he suddenly feels a strange energy flowing through him, as if something has changed within him. The next morning, Brian wakes up to the sound of the radio. The news is that the Thunder team suffered a humiliating loss last night. Brian wondered what happened to Kevin Durant and why he suddenly felt different. However, he got out of bed and headed straight to the bathroom, but from that moment, things took a strange turn. As he entered, he removed his clothes and threw them into the laundry basket outside the door. Although he didn't notice it, every piece landed perfectly inside. Then at school, during biology practicals when the teacher asked him to remove a liver from the specimen tray, Brian effortlessly spun the organ on his finger to the amazement of both Mitch and the teacher. Later that night, Brian and Mitch visited the fun park. There, they spotted Isabel standing next to Connor, who was attempting to win a prize by shooting a basketball. Despite repeated attempts, not a single ball went in. Watching Connor fail, Brian and Mitch laughed, and this infuriated Connor. Frustrated, he challenged Brian to try. Initially, Brian and Mitch turned to leave, but suddenly, Brian turned around and took a shot. The ball went in smoothly. Connor, thinking it was a fluke, handed him another ball. Once again it went in. Even the third attempt went in. Connor was now visibly annoyed, and he angrily walked away. Brian eventually won a giant panda doll for Isabel. The two ended up linking up and they left together, holding the plush toy. Meanwhile, Kevin Durant starts to struggle with his game. His performance was declining, and despite rigorous training, he failed to make his usual shots. At the same time, Brian trained at home, his skills drastically improving overnight. Every shot he took went in, and techniques he had never mastered before now became very easy for him. During practice for the Eagles at school, Brian came in late, wearing the team uniform. He was actually the team's towel boy, but that day, he wanted to play. The coach dismissed him immediately, but Brian insisted his abilities had changed. Without permission, he stepped onto the court, took the ball from Connor's hands, and challenged him to a one-on-one. To everyone's surprise, Brian's skills were beyond anything they had seen. When the coach and his assistant decided to test him, Brian dribbled and even dunked on them with ease. Shocked, the coach had no choice but to reconsider. Brian's comeback was official as he proves that will be a key player for the Eagles. However, during games, Connor refused to pass the ball to him, despite Brian being in perfect positions to score. The coach grew frustrated and warned Connor that if he continued to withhold passes, he would be benched. Realizing he had no choice, Connor finally played as a team. With the ball in his hands, Brian dominated every game, quickly becoming the team's star player. The Eagles kept winning, and Brian was at the center of every victory. His popularity grew fast, and at school, everyone wanted to be around him. In contrast, Kevin Durant's struggles worsened. The media ridiculed his declining performance, and his manager desperately sought ways to revive his confidence. His mother even brought him his grandmother's homemade chicken soup, hoping to lift his spirits. But nothing worked. Meanwhile, Brian and Isabel started to grow closer. They spent more time together, even enjoying a time out at the park. Things got worse for Kevin when he attempted to film a shoe commercial. Every scene required him to make a shot, but he repeatedly failed. Take after take, he either missed or fell awkwardly, and this frustrated the director. At one point, his misfired shot even hit the director. Fed up, the director stormed off, declaring Kevin a complete failure. While Kevin Durant's career slips downward, Brian's rise to fame seemed unstoppable. But the mystery remained. How had Brian's abilities changed so drastically? Still wondering what could have happened, Alan was in his room, watching TV when something caught his attention. The presenter painted a grim picture of Kelvin's recent performances, which raised questions about his future. Frustrated, Alan changed the channel, only to be bombarded by more criticism. Meanwhile, sports analysts continued to debate whether Kevin's recent performances signaled the end of his dominance. Frustrated once more by the talk, Alan flipped through channels until a particular sports show caught his attention. The anchor talked about a rising local player, calling him the next Kevin Durant. Eventually, Alan finds out that the local player was Brian, the same boy who had failed to make the $20,000 shot at the Thunder game weeks earlier. The discussion took an interesting turn as the panel speculated that Brian might have stolen Kevin Durant's talent. Alan's curiosity immediately took over. He studied both players' footage, comparing their techniques. With each clip, the similarities become very clear because Brian's form, movement, and confidence is exactly like Kevin's at his peak. Determined to witness it firsthand, Alan attended one of Brian's games. The young athlete's performance left him stunned. Every shot, every dribble, every move, it was as if Kevin's skill had been transplanted into him. Unsettled by the interesting resemblance, Alan approached Kevin with his theory. He insisted that Brian had somehow absorbed his talent. Kevin, however, dismissed the idea outright, warning Alan to drop the nonsense or risk losing his job. But Alan wasn't ready to let it go just yet. One night, while Brian and Isabel were hanging out, Alan interrupted them. Both were visibly annoyed with the intrusion until Alan introduced himself as Kevin Durant's manager. Brian's frustration quickly turned into excitement. Then, seizing the opportunity, Alan arranged for Kevin to visit Brian's school under the guise of a community outreach program. Kevin believed they were there to support underprivileged students, but he soon realized Alan had orchestrated the visit for an entirely different reason. They entered a classroom in the middle of a math lesson, and Alan wasted no time calling Brian to the front. Kevin immediately recognized him but played along. Then, in a way of introduction, Alan grabbed both Kevin and Brian's hands, swinging them around in a desperate attempt to trigger some sort of reaction. When that failed, he insisted they high-five, hoping to transfer Kevin's lost skills back to their rightful owner. However, nothing happened. Refusing to give up, Alan suggested Kevin and Brian spend more time together. After having lunch in the school cafeteria, they walked down the hallway, and as they talked, Alan had a new idea. He suggested Kevin donate sports shoes to Brian's basketball team, and in the process, Alan makes the two hold each other so he could get a photo of them together. As they prepared to leave, Alan pressed Kevin for any changes. Infuriated by this, Kevin finally snapped. He was already struggling with public scrutiny over his decline, and Alan's antics only made matters worse. So, he asked Alan to just stop. In the meantime, Brian's confidence skyrocketed. However, his game took a darker turn. Instead of playing as a team, he became fixated on proving his skills, refusing to pass to his teammates, and instead prefers to get the glory for himself. At the same time, Kevin's performance continued to get worse. His once unshakable dominance had crumbled, and game after game, his struggles only deepened. Now, their season is slipping away. Commentators declared that the Thunder team was on the verge of not making the playoffs as Kevin Durant's career continues in shambles. The once great player was now unable to score, a shocking downfall that no one could explain. Meanwhile, Brian was out celebrating with his friends, basking in his newfound success. However, not everyone was enjoying the atmosphere. Among the guests, Isabel grew increasingly uncomfortable with Brian's arrogance. Frustrated by his behavior, she stood and walked away. Brian noticed and went after her. When he asked what was wrong, Isabel suggested they talk somewhere private, but before they could, Brian was whisked away by his friends, leaving Isabel frustrated once more as she walked away. In the meantime, Mitch was cleaning a t-shirt with Brian's face when he called to remind Brian about an event they had planned. Unknown to him, Brian was too busy having fun to care. The party was in full swing when suddenly someone shouted that the parents were coming. All the kids hurriedly scrambled to hide, only for Brian to find that the intruder was Alan. He had come to deliver an urgent message: Brian needs to return Kevin Durant's talent. Although Brian was baffled by his insinuations, Alan pressed him, asking if he hadn't noticed something strange: his skills, his performance, all of it. Alan then asked what had been Brian's average score before and after meeting Kevin. Brian admitted that he had never been on the team before, yet now he was scoring 48 points per game. Alan nodded knowingly. Kevin Durant never failed to score, yet now he couldn't make a single shot. The conclusion was obvious: Brian had somehow stolen Kevin's talent. Alan finally tells him that if this continued, the Thunder team would face humiliation and his favorite player with their loyal fans would be devastated. With that, Alan left, leaving Brian devastated. Back at school, the Eagles coach was delivering a speech, preparing the team for their first ever playoff appearance. One by one, the players are introduced, and just before Brian is called, Isabel shows up. When he asks what happened the night at the party and why she left early, she tells him that she feels Brian has changed and that maybe things might return to normal after the season has ended. However, Brian confessed that he believes basketball had been the reason Isabel started noticing him in the first place. To his surprise, she corrected him. She had been watching him since the first day he walked down the hall, long before he became a star player. Brian was surprised by this, but before he could respond, the coach called his name. As he stepped away, Isabel told him to go and do what he needed to do. After the event, Brian talked with the coach and asked how well he was performing. But the coach dismissed his questions and instead urged Brian to stay focused. He was already part of the team. The next day, while riding his bike, Brian stopped abruptly in front of a massive poster of Kevin Durant. The image stared back at him, reminding him of everything Alan had said. Realization finally struck him, and without hesitation, Brian called Alan and asked him to pick him up. Together, they went to find Kevin, who was still practicing. Kevin was puzzled by their sudden arrival and asked what was going on. Brian hesitated before admitting the truth: he wanted to return Kevin's talent. Kevin was skeptical and turned to Alan, questioning if he had put this idea in Brian's head. But Alan insists that Brian shows his new skills to Kelvin. Reluctantly, Brian performed a series of moves that only Kevin Durant should have been capable of. Kevin watched in disbelief. Alan then instructed them to hold a basketball together and repeat the same words they had said the first time they had met. Kevin complied, but nothing happened. They tried everything they could think of, but the talent transfer wouldn't reverse. Frustrated, Brian assured Kevin that he never did this intentionally. Kevin, despite his disappointment, remained calm. He tells Brian that maybe he would just have to start over. With that, he walked away, leaving Brian deep in thought. Still desperate to find a solution, Brian went to Isabel's house. He apologized, then explained everything about the talent swap between him and Kevin Durant. To prove it, he showed her a video from the night it happened. As they watched, Brian suddenly noticed something. The basketball he had thrown had hit the team mascot on the head. That was the exact moment the switch happened. The realization sent a jolt through Brian. Without wasting another second, he jumped on his bike and rode toward the arena. Meanwhile, during one of the last games of the season, Kevin Durant and the Thunder team were struggling. The opposing team had built a massive lead, and the Thunder seemed powerless to stop them. The first half was coming to an end, and defeat seemed inevitable. But just then, Brian arrived in a hurry, riding straight into the stadium. In a desperate bid to set things right, he didn't even stop at the entrance. He rode his bike straight across the court. As chaos erupted among the spectators, the Thunder mascot gave chase, but Brian had no time to waste. When Brian eventually finds Kevin, he quickly informs him that he needs to hit the mascot with the ball first before Kelvin can get his powers back. The mascot, who had been chasing Brian, arrives just then, and without hesitation, Brian throws the ball at the mascot, sending him to the ground. The second half was about to begin when Brian and Kevin retrieved the ball, repeating their previous words but in reverse. Instantly, an electrifying surge flowed through their hands. Within seconds, Kevin's lost ability returned. As if nothing had ever changed, he begins dominating the game, scoring effortlessly and leading the Thunder team to regain momentum. With Kevin back in form, they turned the tide and ultimately secured victory. However, Brian's situation was different. Back at home, his training sessions once again became terrible. He missed his attempts over and over, and his frustration grew. The next day at school, Brian noticed that Mitch had been avoiding him. The tension between them was undeniable, and it was fueled by Brian's sudden success. But Brian wasn't willing to lose their friendship over it. So, he approached Mitch. At first, Mitch ignored him, but he couldn't stay upset for long. Soon, they reconciled and Mitch even gave him a nod to talk to Isabel. With things settled with Mitch and Isabel, Brian and his team prepared for their upcoming match. It was their chance to get into the state's playoffs, but there was a lingering doubt gnawing at Brian. His game was completely off, and he knew it. When the match eventually began, his fears came true. He struggled badly, missing shots and making costly mistakes. The coach quickly called a timeout. Realizing his shortcomings, Brian volunteered to sit the game out, but the coach refused. He assured Brian that his value to the team wasn't just about scoring. Then, in the middle of the game, Kevin Durant and Allen arrived. When Brian saw them, his spirit was lifted. Then, Durant gave him a subtle but knowing signal, and this instantly reignited Brian's determination. Drawing inspiration from the moment, Brian gathered his teammates and adjusted their strategy. Instead of focusing on scoring, he played to his strengths, passing, stealing, and supporting his team. Slowly, the Eagles started closing the gap. With only seconds left and trailing by 2 points, Brian found himself holding the ball in space. However, panic set in and he was not sure of what to do. Finally, making a last-second decision, he went for a risky 3-point shot. The stadium fell silent. Then, the ball sank perfectly through the hoop. The crowd erupted in deafening cheers. Even Durant saluted him as they celebrated. Brian has finally become who he ought to be without someone else's skills. In the final scene, Brian was back with Kevin Durant, practicing free throws. This time, both displayed their skills, proving that true growth comes from perseverance. And that wraps up the recap of the movie, Thunderstruck. If you enjoyed this recap, why don't you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our next recap? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.